pleased to spend some time with you this afternoon to demonstrate to you how important good governance is and how important it is that we have to policymakers demonstrate to you how important good governance measures that are important to building an economy strong. Policymakers demonstrate to you ensuring that you have a stable country. I've been reading a lot about from different commentators, writers on the evolution of Guyana. And as we lay the foundation for our economy 2030 and beyond, I think it's very necessary for us to understand Guyana's development, historical position. We must do so from a position where the basis of analysis is crafted in a fact-based mechanism and not the imaginative presentation of someone who is 2030 and beyond, to go through some very important historical context. Now today you'll have to bear with us. We have a good friend up in the tree with us, the toucan here at State House, and he'll be sharing his meal with us during the course of this conversation. But let me say to you that I want to examine different periods of the political conditions, because that was the period of dictatorship. There was a period of dictatorship prior to 1991 and so on. But I want to start from the period 1991 to 2014, where we had to spend a lot of resources and time on rebuilding a Guyana that was really broken structurally, broken economically, broken socially, and the fabric of our society was completely disintegrated because of what took place during the dictatorship. So from 1991 to 2014, which those government operated and what they had to overcome. So from 1991 to 2014, notwithstanding all that we inherited, we managed to improve our net international reserve at the Bank of Guyana from a deficit those period into our macroeconomic framework and our social conditions that existed. Of course, I'm not going to go into the political conditions because that was a period of dictatorship. There was a period of dictatorship prior to 1991 and so on. But I want to start from the period 1991 to 2014, where we had to spend a lot of resources and time on rebuilding a Guyana that was really broken structurally, broken economically, broken socially, and the fabric of our society was completely disintegrated because of what took place during the dictatorship. So from 1991 to 2014, what occurred in this country? Because I think it's a great injustice to successive People's Progressive Party civic government for one not to understand the context in which those governments operated and what they had to overcome. So from 1991 to 2014, notwithstanding all that we inherited, we managed to improve our net international reserve at the Bank of Guyana from a deficit of US $27.9 million to a surplus of US $625 million. This is without oil and gas. This is with all the social and economic mess that we had in our country. We had successive PP civic government who moved our net international reserve in 1991 from a deficit of US $27.9 million to a surplus in 2014 of $652 million. Whilst we were able to improve our net international reserve from that deficit to a surplus, we also were able to reduce inflation from 70.3% to 1.2%. Yes, my dear friends, in 1991, inherited a deficit of net international reserve of 27.3 million US, inflation at 70.3%, and we reduced that to 1.2%. We did all of that, whilst at the same time increasing our public sector minimum wage from Guyana $2,546 to Guyana $42,702. This is without oil and gas. The PPP civic government between 1991 and 2014 did not need oil and gas to let us understand that the monthly minimum wage of our country was extremely low and needed to be addressed. During this period, the minimum wage of our country increased by 1,577%. 1,577%. In fact, just under 2 years, from January 1993 to January 1995, the then PP civic government increased minimum wage by 100%. So between 1993 and 1995, when you had to deal with a deficit, a deficit of 27.9 million US dollars international reserve, inflation of 70%, we were able to increase minimum wage by 100%, and by the time you got up to 2014, when we left government, by 1,577%. From 1991 to 2014, the PPP civic government managed to reduce our external debt. Yes, a lot of commentators like to talk about external debt. Between 1991 and 2014, the PPP civic government managed to reduce our external debt from US $2 billion to $1.2 billion, while reducing our external debt to GDP ratio. Yes, my dear friends, there was a time in our country when our debt to GDP ratio was 677%. That is when we took office in 1991. And by 2014, we managed to reduce that debt to GDP ratio from 677% to 34%. In the social sector, within the same period, we managed to reduce infant mortality rate. That is the number of children who per thousand, the number of babies per 1,000 live birth who died. When we came into government in 1991, it was 43. By the time we left government, we reduced that to 47%, from 43 to 23. There was a time when the number of physicians, doctors per 10,000 population was 2. Yes, my friends. In 1991, when we came into government, there were 2 doctors per every 10,000 people in our country. By the time we left in 2014, that increased by 600% to 14 doctors per 10,000 people. When you look at nurses, there was a time when for every 10,000 population, we had 6 nurses. By the time we left in 2014, we had 30 nurses per every 10,000 population, an increase of 400%. This is a scenario in which Guyana was founded in 1991, and the work that we put in to leave it in a better place in 2014. At the central government level, we increased investment in education as a share of the national budget. There's a lot of people who are talking about the evolution of the education sector. In 1991, education as a percentage of the national budget was only 1.9%. 1.9%.
By the time we got up to 2014, education as a share of the national budget was 14.8%. At the same time, we were able to increase our investment in health as a share of the national budget from 2.9% in 1991 to 10%. At the community level, whilst we made all of these investments and still had to work on a $2 billion external debt that we reduced to $1.2 billion US dollars, and invest in education and health, we were able to reduce serious crime from 8,084 in 1991 to 3,688 by the time we left office, a reduction of 54%. Now, so I wanted to recount that period in our history, so you'll understand when you have a government with bad policies and measures, and when you had a government that with policies and measures that transform the economic landscape of our country. And I'm giving you the facts so you can draw your own analysis. This is not hearsay or illusion. These are the facts. Now it's important for us to examine, and let me say this. My intention is over the next 3 days to go through, because I want every Guyanese to understand the evolution of things and where we are going. So what took place between 2015 and 2019? In a nutshell, I think we need to understand what took place between 2015 and 2019. Between 2015 and 2019, things changed dramatically under the APNO AFC government. Remember where we took the country in 1991? I've just positioned that, and where we left it in 2014. So the period 2015 to 2019 is now very important. What took place in these 4 years? The output levels of our main traditional sectors were on a free fall, all declining rapidly. In the sugar industry, between this period, between 2014 and 2019, the aggregate level, the total production contracted by almost $21 billion. Whilst forestry and bauxite contracted, forestry, so it's not only sugar that contracted by $21 billion, forestry contracted by $31 billion, bauxite contracted by $9 billion. This represents a total contraction of the productive sector of $61.5 billion, or 8% of the 2019 GDP at 2012 prices. This is of the 2019 GDP at 2012 prices. In terms of export, when you look at what the contraction costs us in terms of aggregate, in an aggregate sense, in the value of export, the decline of these sectors had cost us between 2014 and 2019 more than US $285 million. More than US $285 million. In one transaction alone in this new government, the carbon credit, new, innovative, exciting, visionary, we earn more than this contraction in an aggregate sense. At the level of the central bank, what we saw in these 4 years. Remember, I told you about the historical context, the work that it took to recover our economy, where we left it, and what took place in that 4 years. At the level of the central bank, what we saw was massive reduction in our reserve. Again, once again, in the history of our country. In fact, from 2014 to 2017, the gold reserve at the Bank of Guyana fell from $25 billion, from $25 billion in 2014 to $800 million in 2019. That is what took place with our gold reserve. The new government came in 2014, $25 billion of gold reserve. left in 2019, it moved from 25 billion to 800 million. This represents a decline of 97%. A decline in our gold reserve at the Bank of Guyana of 97%. Equally worrisome was the fact that the central government overdraft at the Bank of Guyana had increased by more than 114 billion or 540%. So imagine the reserves are depleting and the overdraft increased by over 540% or $114 billion. Whilst deficit by central government, the deficit in the central government, this is after oil now, the deficit in the central government moved from 9.3 billion in 2015 to almost 30 billion by the end of 2019, an increase of 222%. This is what we came in and met. This is what all the great writers who are writing should focus on, these numbers. This is the reality of what the new government meant. Within a span of just 2 years in office, the APNU AFC government introduced in excess of 200 plus new taxes and measures on private businesses and the consumer. But what was the net effect of this? What was the net effect of these new taxes that were introduced? Of course, it led to an increase in tax revenues and duties from 136 billion in 2014 to 226 billion by the end of 2019, an increase of 66%. Of this amount, VAT increased by 43%, from 37.3 billion to 52.5 billion. VAT increased by 43%. Putting this into perspective, the effective tax rate as of 2014 was 15%. That is the totality of the tax rate. While at the end of 2019, so this is a government that came in 2015 with an effective tax rate of 15%. At the end of 2019, when this government is going out, the effective tax rate moved to 22% and increased by 7%. What does this mean? What it meant is that the people in 2019 had to pay an average of 22 cents earned on every dollar. In 2014, they were paying an average of 15 cents earned on every dollar. Whilst in 2022, they were paying an average of 22 cents earned on every dollar. This is the reality of what that 200 plus tax measures meant. I hope our technical people are not having difficulties with our transmission. I see a lot of movements because they kind of have these difficulties from time to time. I don't know why. Now, when you look at our tax rate and the 200 plus taxes and what it meant to private consumption, that is what our ordinary people were consuming. You just have to look on page 713 of the 2020 budget estimate, volume 1, appendix G. And you will see that the level of private consumption in 2019 compared to 2014 reduced by more than $77 billion. This was the net effect. That is why the businesses were feeling the effect. Small businesses were closing their doors. Medium-sized businesses were going into bankruptcy because the net effect of the more than 200 plus taxes was that private consumption declined by $77 billion. Private consumption declined by $77 billion. In fact, as a share of GDP, private consumption fell from 82.7% to 53% by the end of 2019. This means the rate of spending by our people fell by almost 20 cents on every dollar earned in that 4 year. So not only were taxes burdensome and businesses were going to bankruptcy and all of these things, but the spending reduced by 20 cents on every dollar. So those who speak about small business development and medium-sized business development, this is what contributed, this is what led to the destruction of small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, the decline in domestic credit to the private sector is seen in the amount of credit allocated to agriculture, manufacturing, and construction sector respectively. Between 2014 and 2019, you got to remember, this is the period oil is found, 2015, oil is discovered. You got to remember,
confidence was supposed to be its highest. Massive construction
was supposed to be going on, but what took place? Let us examine what took place. Between 2014 and 2019, credit to the construction sector, first let's look at credit to agriculture. Credit to agriculture declined by $1 billion. Credit to manufacturing declined by $3 billion. And credit to construction declined by $3 billion. This is what the bad policies and measures led to. What was the net effect? In the banking sector, non-performing loan as a ratio of the gross loans, what took place with non-performing loan? Non-performing loans increased from an average of 7% in 2014 to 14.8% by the end of 2019. Yes, my dear friends. Yes, my dear friends. Non-performing loans are loans that people can't service in the banking sector. What took place during the period of APNU AFC is that the rate of non-performing loans in the commercial bank grew from 7% to 14.8%. What this means is not only our banks were receiving significantly less on their investment, but that investors were finding it extremely difficult to service their debt. This is why we saw such a huge increase in non-performing loan, because people can't pay their loans, businesses are closing, such a huge increase in unemployment, all of which we have fixed. And in the next segment, I'll be addressing this. But what is even more concerning during this period is that the household took a huge hit in 2019 compared to 2018. With non-performing loans at the household sector, that is in the families, in the household, in your homes, the non-performing loans increasing by $1.9 billion, or 22%. It increased, by 22%. So at the household level, you had $10.6 billion of credit that people could not pay. What this means is that an additional 2 out of every 10 persons did not have the ability to finance their mortgage. Yes, my dear friends. In that 4 years, this is what we inherited. 2 out of every 10 person could not or did not have the ability or the wherewithal to repay that debt that they had in the commercial bank. We fixed it. The next segment I will go to how we have fixed all of this. So I want to pause here, and in the next segment in this discourse, I would want to address 2020 and 2022 and to demonstrate to you using facts and figures how our government, your government, through strong policy formulation and measures, was able to bring back our economy and put it on a path of prosperity and stability. Thank you.